So, I guess for the record, what did inspire you to become a painter?
Moby Grape. Skip was one of my best friends. Skip Spence was one of my best friends. And I saw all the crap he went through with Moby Grape. And I really wanted to do something in the arts. And basically, I just did not want to go through any of the crap that Skip went through, so I became a painter instead of a musician. Little Richard also helped too. I did a drawing of him one time, and I showed it to him the next day. And he said, "Oh, Paul, can I have that?" And I said, "Yeah, thank you."
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And so Skip was always one of the biggest influences on me, and I was between being a musician and being a painter, and then I saw all the crap he went through with Moby Grape, and I said, it's like, well, if I'm a painter, I'm not going to have anybody else involved in the creative process, only marketing after the fact. So that's what I did was marketing. I became a painter instead, and then we kind of had a fight one time at the chateau, and he told me I'm selling out. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, go figure it out yourself. So I took off hitchhiking and went up to the Pacific Northwest for summer. And it's like I just started, seeing all this beautiful stuff. And, I got to paint this. And I got to paint this. I also ran into a book of Vincent van Gogh's the same summer.
Yeah.
And that was the first I ever saw of him. And then I ran into the book Dear Teo, which was an very abridged version of his letters, but a very good abridged version of his letters to his brother.
Okay.
And between all of that, I decided I'm going to become a painter. And I went back to Santa Barbara, and my friend Pat, who's coming over tonight, Pat Hennigan, he was a DJ at KIST in Santa Barbara. He did the Graveyard, and I'd sleep on the couch while he was doing his DJ work, and then he let me stay in his apartment for a year. And I dedicated that year to just drawing in black and white, because I took basically Vincent's do-it-yourself painting course.
Okay.
From his complete letters. The next thing I did was I read his complete letters that year.
Oh, so that kind of instructs you as to his technique then.
Totally.
Oh, that's great. Wow.
It's like he explained it to an idiot, because his brother was going to cut him off at one point.
Oh.
Because his brother supported him all his life, and at one point he was going to cut him off.
Wow.
And Vincent explained his technique to an idiot, which, to me was great, because I knew nothing about this. And one of the things he said was to take a year and don't do anything in color, just do black and white, because most people never really learn black and white. And if you look at the modern painters, you don't see any tonal values, you don't see any depth to them. It's just all flat, and it's like mainly what it is mixing color with white and putting it on a canvas, and that's where you get pastel colors, your California plein air painters, and any plein air painters, and that's what it is. What I did is I learned how to do that in about an hour, and then Vincent said to paint mud, and juxtapose it. So that's what I did, and I went for about 2 years where I painted every day without painting a picture that I liked, and that was hard. And then I went and studied at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and copied their paintings there. All the ones, I spent a year there copying most all of the ones that I really liked. And I learned a lot by doing that. And I was reading Vincent's letters, Delacroix's journal, and whatever tidbits they had posted at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I had a curator there who I talked to from time to time, a lady named Alex Murphy. And so, that's how I learned to paint, was by copying from the masters. And then I moved back to Santa Barbara, and all the color theory I had studied and learned, I rapidly got to practice it with all the flower gardens around Santa Barbara. I had this old man named Pete Martino, who was a gardener, and I started painting his garden, and he had these big blue delphiniums. And I painted them for a couple of years, and then after that he would plant them every year so that I would come back and paint them, which I did until probably about the mid-'80s. So how did I come out to California?
Yeah.
Why don't you ask me that?
Yeah, so how did you come out to California?
Well, I was bouncing around Maine and Boston in 1969 and taking a lot of drugs and dealing some, small-time stuff. And at some point, I just said, I got to get away from here. I had 2 days, I was fighting the draft, and then I had 2 days, one of them I almost drowned in one of the most polluted rivers in Maine, the Androscoggin. And then the next day I went through a stone wall at 70 miles an hour.
The very next day.
And the very next day. And I was with the same 2 guys. And I just kind of, it's like something's telling me to leave here. So I waited until, I was feeling better. I tore up a toe. So I waited and then took off one day hitchhiking for New York. I was standing at the end of the Main Turnpike, and some pretty girl picked me up. She wasn't going to New York, but she was going to Philadelphia. You can come to Philadelphia with me if you want, sure. And I stayed there for about a month. And then one night, I'm loaded on speed, and there were some people over, and they said, oh, we're leaving now. And I said, oh, where are you going? They said, Chicago. And I said, can I come? And they said, sure. So I went to Chicago, and by that time, I didn't stay. I stayed maybe about a day, 2 days, and I had friends in Lincoln, Nebraska, because I went to school in western Nebraska, so I went to see Grady in Lincoln. And then I figured, well, I'm halfway to California, so I might as well go to California.
Yeah, why not, huh?
And so I stuck out my thumb and started hitchhiking. And I got to San Francisco. I had some friends, Richard and Gwen Schilling, there. And I got out of the car in San Francisco and just in the middle of June and just froze my butt off. And that's my big memory of it. And actually, I guess it's probably in July, because I spent the 4th of July in a small town in Nebraska. But so anyhow, I ended up in San Francisco, and that's when I stopped doing speed. It's one of the 2 things that I've actually quit in my life, the other one being tobacco.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can understand that.
Yeah. So that's how I ended up in California, and I just stayed. I mean, the first day I ended up in Berkeley, I just sat on Telegraph Avenue all day, and it's like, whoa, this place is wild. And it's just like culture shock, and I stayed. And then
I guess those were the days to actually be in the Berkeley area,
Yeah, and there's also the days when you could hitchhike easily.
Yeah.
And that's what I was doing. That was my mode of travel. And you could do that then for probably about that was 69, maybe about another 4 or 5 years. And then that was pretty much the end of that. So I really wanted to get into music or the arts somehow. I had been into rock and roll since they invented it, since Little Richard invented it in '55. I had an older sister who was in high school, and she got me into it. And so I just kind of, I had no idea how to go about it. Didn't play an instrument. And then one day I met Skip Spence, and Skip was friendly to me, and he gave me his phone number and said give him a call sometime after 11. And we got to be friends.
He's a cool guy.
Huh?
Really cool guy.
Oh, Skip Spence is one of the great geniuses of our time. And underrated.
Very underrated. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he had personal problems that kind of obscured his genius. Well, they didn't really. It's just he was so hard to deal with on a personal level. And that was a lot of it then. And so anyhow, but Skip, I hung around with him, and I just learned a lot just hanging around with him because he talked to me about, one of the things he said was he stressed with the arts. One day he said to me, Paul, you know who made Eric Clapton? I says, no, I have no idea. He says, John Mayall made Eric Clapton because he made him sit and play for 6 hours every day. And he stressed the value of doing that every day. And other people who I found that stressed that same value were Eugene Delacroix, Vincent van Gogh, and all of those people stressed the value of doing it. You got to do it every day, even if it's it's better to fail 1,000 times than not to try.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So Skip did that, and then one day we were all living at the Chateau Liberté, the Danny Barnett's van in the Redwood Grove there, and Skip and I had a fight, and he told me that you're selling out, and what do you mean, Skip? Don't know. What do you mean, Skip? He says, go figure it out on your own. So I went hitchhiking up in the Pacific Northwest, and long story short, I became a painter.
Yeah, yeah.
I had painted, the first thing I did was a drawing of Little Richard one night, and I showed it to him the next day, and, oh, Paul, can I have that? Yeah, thank you, Richard. And that was something the king of rock and roll likes my painting, my drawing,
Oh, so you actually gave Little Richard himself your drawing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's too cool.
Yeah.
That is too cool, and he liked it.
He liked it. At least he said he did. That was all I cared about.
That's enough, right?
Yeah. It's like the king of rock and roll likes my drawing. And it was a couple years before I actually decided to become a painter after that. It's probably about 73 was the summer I went hitchhiking. It was the summer of Watergate when I went hitchhiking up in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, okay.
And then my friend Pat Hennigan let me sleep on his couch for a year, and without paying rent. And while he did the graveyard shift at a radio station in Santa Barbara.
Okay.
And I practiced drawing during that whole time. I didn't paint, which is something Vincent told me I should do, because nobody else does that, and it really shows in the work, because the work, you can see the superficiality of the work because these people don't know anything about tonal values. And so I did that, and then I just moved to Boston and copied the paintings of the Museum of Fine Arts that I liked there. And talked to one of the curators whenever I had the opportunity, a lady named Alex Murphy. And I painted every day. And I went through a period of about a year where Vincent told me, it's like, in his letters, he said to, mix your colors together and, do dark, paint dark. Because that's where you're going to find your tonal values. And I painted for about every day for about 2 years, where I didn't paint a single picture I liked, and that's hard.
Yeah.
And then it's like when I got to Boston, the colors started to thaw. The curator of paintings there, John Walsh, used to come up and talk to me in the galleries, and he'd point out, your picture's a lot darker than that, and I'd say, yeah, I know. But it's like I continued to do it, and eventually when I got back to Santa Barbara, I knew all this color theory, and then I was just assaulted with all of these gorgeous flower gardens there, and that's where I really learned how to color, was when I went back to Santa Barbara after Boston.
Wow.
Yeah, and I painted a lot of flower gardens, all the color theory that I learned, and my colors were strong because of the fact that I had painted dark. It's like I look at people now, and there's hardly any color in their work, and they are very successful at it as far as selling.
Yeah.
I never really tried to sell my work because that's one of the reasons why I got into painting as opposed to music, was so that I could just paint and create my art without anyone else having to participate in it. The only participation I needed from outside was selling, and I was never any good at selling. So I didn't. I got myself a real cushy radio gig doing classical music in Santa Barbara for 22 years.
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, and I worked weekend nights, Saturday and Sunday, from 4 to midnight for 22 years, and that supported me.
Wow.
And then I was able to arrange my life so that I painted every day. And I painted like 7 to 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, about 320 days a year, and did that for 40 years. So that's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of sick now for the first time in my 66 years, so I don't, it's like my priorities now have shifted a little bit to getting my website, paulb.com.
Yeah.
My new website, paulb.com, my priorities have shifted to getting all the pictures looking like the new format. And then, I'm still painting a lot, most every day. But it's like this week I had a friend of mine up from Sacramento, and I haven't painted, and then I had to get blood, and I haven't, and then you guys are here, so we're going up the mountain,
right.
And I haven't done any painting this week, but that's okay. It's like, I've got over 2,000 paintings now.
That's
it's
really
like
neat.
I don't really see where my legacy is going to be determined on whether I have 2025 or 2055. It's like whatever legacy I leave, I'm leaving regardless of whether I do any more, but I do it. And
right.
Yeah, it's like I'm focusing more on getting the website and getting the stuff out there now for somebody hopefully will come along and sell it for me. So that's what I'm working on right now.
All right. Yeah, I certainly hope everything clicks, and goes totally favorable in every respect. But I've visited your website numerous times from years ago on up to just a few days ago.
Yeah.
And it's impressive, how many beautiful paintings are just all over that thing. Plus,
I have about 700 paintings on the website.
That's pretty good.
And I look at the stuff that's not on there, and I'm like, God, it's like I could do 3 times as many as this, and none of the quality would suffer at all.
Yeah.
And I've still got all that stuff, that dark on dark stuff that I did during the 2 years that I painted every day and didn't paint anything I liked, just so I could have, at some point, like Vincent, a museum where, you could trace how I learned and, the various stages I went through from, painting every day when I didn't have anything that I liked. Obviously, there wouldn't be many of those, but I've got them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I really focused on all my life, was to save paintings from every period. I've also got a journal that I've been keeping since 1973, and I've got 72 volumes of it now, where I learned how to paint.
That's good.
Yeah, the Boston ones are very instructive to anyone, somebody who wants to paint, learn how to do that.
So essentially then you've also done your own recording of your own methodology as well.
Yeah.
And that's excellent. I mean, that's a good legacy to leave,
Well, also, one of the things that Vincent said was, be a master of one thing and other things will follow.
Yeah.
So I did my classical music show on KBB for 22 years. During that time, the pay in radio, the saying is that in radio, the pay sucks, but you get a lot of free stuff. And I got a lot of free stuff. I got ballet tickets, San Francisco Opera tickets, LA Opera tickets, and, Shakespeare Festival and all of this. I've seen and reviewed every major ballet company in the world, and I've seen and reviewed all 38 Shakespeare plays, including Two Noble Kinsmen, which is not part of the repertoire. And I've also seen all of the operas I wanted to see. To me, one of the best things about the breakup of the Soviet Union were the cultural exchanges that were taking place then. And San Francisco Opera was right at the forefront of that, along with the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. Valery Gergiev, who's the artistic director at Mariinsky, and I think he's the associate artistic director at the Met now. but he wasn't the star, the sought-after star then that he is now. So it's like his big venue in the United States was San Francisco Opera.
Okay.
And Ann and I went to see my longtime significant other and beloved Ann Prebis. She and I went to see all that stuff. And when we go to San Francisco, we'd usually stay in San Jose.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like we'd talk about what we had just seen on the way home, on the way back to the motel, and then I'd write my review. So she was very involved in that. But, you know, it's like, and, you know, a big part of that. So, I mean, you know, I've done a lot of stuff other than just painting, too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's
And that stuff's all on my website, too.
Right.
Along with most of my journal. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally awesome. Yeah. It was, well, when we first met, you and I and Ann first got together, I guess in summer of '99, somewhere in there, and
So that's because it was after Skip died.
it was after Skip died.
Yeah.
And so it was, yeah, a few months after that. And I know you would come back and forth and we would visit whenever you were between Santa Barbara and San Francisco when you were checking out the operas and stuff.
Yeah.
And that was pretty cool. You know, that was really neat.
Yeah.
A lot of good memories.
Actually, I was hanging out with Little Richard at the time. And Skip was getting ready to do a recording session at Pacific Studio in San Mateo, and I happened to mention it to Richard. And Richard says, "Oh, I know Skip Spence." And I said, "You do?" And he says, "Yeah." And I told him that, well, Skip's going to be doing a recording session at this studio in San Mateo, and I'm going up to, you know, the Bay Area for that. And Richard said, "Can you give me the phone numbers?" So I did. And that night, we're in the studio, and I had never known any of this before. Skip had never told me any of it.
Wow.
But we're in the studio, and about 1 or 2 in the morning, the phone rings. David Rubinson was the producer of the tape. The tape was Space Song and All My Life, which are, All My Life is one that Skip has written, and it's been recorded and released in various forms, but never this version that I have from the original studio version.
Yeah.
And I just sent that master tape of All My Life and Space Song to Skip's publisher, Lynn Quinlan. I just sent that. It's supposed to get there Monday. So, yeah, I'm not going to be around much longer, so I wanted that preserved, and that's where I generally go to preserve Skip stuff. So anyhow, we're in the studio. It's about 1 or 2 o'clock, and Skip's just going wild in the studio. If you've never been in a studio with him, you know, a big studio where he's got a lot of room to work, move around, and stuff like that, it's impressive. And, you know, he's playing his guitar and everybody else is playing, and, you know, he's arranging and organizing and conducting everybody, and just pretty much running the session. And he goes over and he's playing on the keyboards, and all of a sudden the phone rings. David Rubinson, the producer, picks up the phone, and I'm in the booth with David, and David picks up the phone, and he says, "Who?" And then there's a pause, and he says, "Who are you?" And then there's another pause, and he says, "Does Skip know you?" And all of a sudden, "Oh, hey Skip, Little Richard's on the phone and he wants to talk to you." Skip steps away from the keyboard, and he says, he just yells to nobody in particular, everybody in general, "The king of rock and roll's on the phone and he wants to talk to me."
Yeah.
So Skip and Richard have a conversation, which I don't know what it was. But the next time I saw Richard, he started talking to me about it, and he was telling me. He says, "Yeah, I called Skip, and, well, I called Skip, and the guy on the phone who answered the phone, I said, he says, 'Who is this?' I said, 'Richard Penniman.' And he didn't know who I was.
Oh, that's incredible.
So finally I says, 'Little Richard,' and you know, he figured it out then. And it turns out that Skip told me, he said, you know did you know Little Richard? And Skip says, oh yeah. He says, when Richard retired back in 1957 from rock and roll to become a minister, I called him up and said, Little Richard, you can't retire from rock and roll. You got to stay in rock and roll. We need you out there. And Little Richard says, Skip, I've got other things I have to do. You know, the Lord is calling me, and I need to do that. And he formed Little Richard's Traveling Ministry Show or something like that, and moved it all to L.A. And it was funny because there's a story about that. There's a great film of Little Richard's life on there, and it stops about 1963.
Yeah.
But Richard is the executive producer on it, and he talks about when he retired, and it's like he took like $1,000 ring, and $1,000 in 1957 was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he threw it in the ocean. And so the people with him say, what are you going to do that for? What are you doing that for? And he says, well, if it doesn't cost anything, it's not really worth much. And, you know, your conversion isn't really worth anything unless it costs you something. So he threw that ring in the ocean, and then he was supposed to take a plane back to the United States, and he postponed that plane ride, and the plane crashed and everybody was killed.
Ooh, so he missed being killed by like a hair.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, you know, he attributed it to the fact that he, you know, had that conversion. So he came back and he quit rock and roll, and at the peak of his fame, and had a Christian ministry. And then he picked up rock and roll later. He got back into rock and roll in 1963. Went to Germany and played some gigs there, and he had a little-known band that was opening for him called the Beatles. And taught Paul McCartney how to do the whoo and all of that. And you know, the Beatles made it pretty big after Richard left them.
Wow.
Or after they left Richard. But and Skip, I guess, had called him, and you know, it was, you know, Skip was a pretty spiritual guy.
Yeah,
and
he was.
That probably had a lot to do with it. You know, we talked about a little bit about that, but Skip didn't talk a lot about that. You had to, you know, press him to talk about that. But I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And then Skip, you know, after that, Skip had called him back in 1957, and Richard returned the call in 1971. You know.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cycle of events.
Yeah. And I had never known any of that. You know, Richard's the one who told me his end of that conversation, and that he had known Skip back, you know, a long time ago. And Skip had never told me any of that until I asked him and pressed him about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Bit of history there.
Yeah, it is.
It really is, yeah. So the band that Skip had at that time, the Yankees, as you informed me, because I learned all that from you originally.
Yeah, well, that was kind of fluid. You know, the name of the band was kind of fluid. Actually, the membership was kind of fluid, too.
Yeah. You know,
It was a really good band, though.
Yeah.
And one of the things Skip had told me was that after he arranged the first Grape album, which was the real classic, and I know a lot of the members of the Grape would dispute that, but Skip told me that, and his mother told me that, and everybody who was around there associated with Skip told me that. So, and that's what I believe. And I mean, you look at the sound of the first Grape album, and you look at everything else they did after that, and it was all completely different.
Well, you know, I don't think they would dispute that necessarily, because I've heard from the horse's mouth at least a couple of times that I remember both Peter Lewis and Jerry Miller saying that Skip was the guy.
Skip was the only one that was ready to go in the studio.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought Peter would dispute it. I didn't know.
He said he learned a lot from Skip, actually.
I did. Okay.
Yeah.
I've only spoken to Peter once for about 3 hours on the phone, and then I saw him play the next day. And it's hard to ignore somebody in a room full of 15 people. But Peter did just a wonderful job of ignoring me in that room. So I don't know. I said something he didn't. He really took exception to. I don't know what it was, but it probably had to do with Skip.
Yeah.
And
Huh.
and I know Skip. I know when Skip had his mental breakdowns. I know even back in the '70s, Peter was helping him out then.
Oh yeah.
So I know Peter has done a lot for Skip.
Yeah.
And Skip has mentioned that also. Peter had a house in the San Ynez Valley, and the drummer for Buffalo Springfield, Dewey Martin, was another one of those guys who just kind of got cast by the wayside. And Peter was helping out Dewey, I know,
Yeah.
at some point. So yeah, I mean Peter, and you know, so I know Peter has been doing that, and he did it all of Skip's life from the '70s on.
Yeah, he did. I used to when I was hanging out and working with Skip on some material back in the '90s. Let's say from late '95 on up to the end of '98, before Skip passed on a few months after that.
Yeah.
Peter came by and visited regularly, and sometimes all three of us were jamming together a little bit, you know,
Yeah.
right in the kitchen of the house that Skip was staying in. You know?
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool.
The only time I ever met Peter was after I had that 3-hour phone conversation with him. I went to see him at a place called the Coffee Gallery Backstage in Altadena. It's a little venue of about 20 people.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, just Peter and his guitar. And that's the only time I ever met the guy.
Okay.
And as I say, we didn't have much of a conversation.
Yeah.
But, you know, and
But, you know, getting back to the Yankees, I just thought I would interject this real quick. In November 2002, yeah, it was November 2002, Bob Dylan played at the Greek Theater in Berkeley. I tried to get in there, but, you know, I blew it because I didn't get a ticket in advance. So I thought, well, you know, it's probably not going to sell out, even though it's going to pack the place. You know, big mistake. But it was I think it was intended to happen, though, because when I went out there, I realized, wow, there's no way I'm going to get a ticket. There's
you
no
met
way.
Bruce Ginsberg.
I met Bruce Ginsberg. I went back to the area in back of the theater, past where the little parking lots were, and past, you know, where there's a little hill up there that's got a wooden stairway going all the way up it. And I was hanging out there, and he showed up, and we were talking the whole time during the show. We'd occasionally listen to a song, you know, we could hear it back there even though we couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And I found out, we got on the subject of music, and one thing led to another, and then he mentioned a guy named Rick Townsend, and I just turned around and said, oh, are you talking about the Rick Townsend? The guy that played guitar in a band called the Yankees? And it was just like, he lit up, and I realized, you know, then he told me, yeah, I was the drummer for the Yankees.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, wow, so we both knew Skip then.
Yeah.
You know, that was like one of those things that, you know, what are the odds of it ever happening? And it just seemed like there was some kind of synchronicity at work just for that whole episode right there.
Oh, I'm sure there was.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's funny because Skip and I used to talk a lot about, you know, Moby Grape and stuff like that. And he said after the first album, Skip never did anything that wasn't a joke. He never did a serious song again with Moby Grape after that. And the last time I saw Skip was about 1974, so this is the frame of reference I'm talking about. But all he did was joke songs, and I asked him, what about...
Seeing.
I says, I know a lot of that stuff. Yeah, I asked him about, what about Seeing? And he says, that was just an old track that they stuck on, that they wanted to put on Grape 69. That was something we had done a long time ago. So that didn't count in Skip's mind. And because he wasn't the one that put it on the recording, and it wasn't any sort of new recording. It was just something that was involved.
I get it.
And I asked him about, what about Chinese Song? And he says, Paul, Chinese Song it's named Chinese Song, and it's played on a Japanese instrument. I know the difference.
Yeah, right. I've always wondered about that.
Yeah.
But it's a great song.
Oh, it is. I mean, a lot of those. I mean, Funky Tonk was a great song, but I mean, it was a joke.
Yeah.
And there's no other way you can look at it. So I thought that was real interesting, and especially considering the fact that when he did Chinese Song on 20 Granite Creek, he also had All My Life in his pocket, and he had Space Song in his pocket, another song called Sailing Ships. And
Oh yeah.
Skip, I mean, it's funny because after we did that recording session, we went to there's a Lions restaurant across the street, and Skip wanted more ketchup for his hamburger. He didn't have enough ketchup. So he made up a song. I want more ketchup. And when the waitress came, he sang her this song that he had just made up 10 minutes before.
Right.
And I mean, it was amazing. And then the band, we went down and played, got them some gigs in Santa Barbara. And we went down and played in Santa Barbara, and they performed this song. I need more ketchup.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, he had a comedian side to him.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's just like, Skip, they say Mozart would leave a party and come back an hour later with a piano concerto. Skip was a lot like that too.
Okay.
I mean, even when he was, when he was young like that until, he had his big breakdown. But he even had a few of those after his breakdown. But Skip, I mean, the guy was just amazing like that. And he always had new songs, and instead of asking you a question, he would write a song about it,
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, he had, great songs. He just wouldn't play them with a grape.
I see. Yeah, I see. Or else, yeah.
And that's pretty much what got me into paintings. I just didn't want to have to deal with any of that stuff. My art was my escape and, my peace of mind and stuff like that, and I just didn't want to have to deal with that. That's where I let out all of my violence, and everything else was into my art, and I didn't want to have to break guitars and, things like that.
Yeah, any kind of artistic expression is an incredibly good outlet.
Yeah, it is.
Because I became a musician, but when I was a kid, I was into the visual arts too.
Well, still, it's like, the great musicians really bang on their instruments too. I mean, It's not like treat this gently, when you're playing it.
Yeah.
When you're not playing it, and don't let anybody else touch it. With a lot of people, and Skip, to his credit, always let me play anything I wanted to play of his.
Uh-huh.
Including his guitar that Gordon Stevens made for him that was covered in cowhide and had foot and a half bull horns curling up around the neck.
Also, Gordon Stevens made that for him. Huh?
Yeah, I know.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard stories about that instrument.
I saw him play it on stage once when he was playing with Dr. John the Night Tripper. He was just a sideman that John hired when he played the Fillmore. And I look up on stage and there's Skip with a gold suit and that guitar with the bullhorns curling up around the neck. I didn't even know he was going to be playing that night.
So you were there.
Oh yeah.
I'd only heard about it, through reading an article about him. Might have been the one that Johnny Angel did back in 1994. But yeah, I'd read about him.
Oh, I swear to God, Dr. John was like, the show he put on was just spectacular. But it could have been God up there itself. You would still have to look at Skip.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt.
So.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah, why don't we wrap this up and get up the mountain?
Yeah, well, that was good.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Right
it
on.
was.
Okay.